What's happening, guys? My name is JokerXP and welcome to some gameplay from Star Wars Battlefront's open beta. Now today we're going to talk about the mechanics in Battlefront, how the game feels and how it plays overall, and why the casual vibe behind playing this game is not really a bad thing. And just as a brief heads up, I am in no way at all connected to EA or DICE, and this is not a sponsored video. The clips you're going to be watching will be first off some drop zone streaks going on Solist, pulling off some nice streaks controlling certain lanes, trying to handle different sides of the map for the drop zone, and then of course some great and necessary ATST action coming at you straight from Hoth. These are my main takeaways from Star Wars Battlefront so far. First off, we gotta give some major credit where it's due, and that is a great big shout out to DICE, because for the first time, I think ever in their history as a developer, they've actually released a beta that was rock solid in terms of the mechanical stability. There was no client-side crashing, no server crashing, no queue or server wait times you had to deal with, and almost all of the bugs and in-game glitches are what you would usually expect in your typical beta for any game. Now, it seems that the reason for this, for why DICE released such a stable build to the beta, is because there wasn't exactly that much content designed in the first place. In other words, it looks like the final game's not going to have that much content. I'll get to that in a minute, but more on the good things about the beta. So that Frostbite engine, man, it brought out those environments. Like, I'm saying, these terrains, these environments, and these classic epic scenes from Star Wars like the Battle on Hoth just looked stunning. All of the effects, all of the explosive effects weren't too over the top, and there wasn't this chaos of explosive spam like we saw in Battlefield 4. So everything aesthetically and visually speaking looked pretty balanced and pretty damn good. And I'd say the same goes for the audio design, not only because of all the effects and all the blaster fire and explosive sounds, but also because they included original soundtrack music from Star Wars. And it wasn't overkill either. It wasn't like a non-stop soundtrack. I mean, it would come and go at certain times. Like on Walker Assault, the soundtrack actually served as audio cues for when heroes on opposing teams were entering the field. And personally speaking, as a huge Star Wars fan, having said my personal history growing up watching these movies, getting into the games and the books, I was having a real blast when I first started up this game. The thing is, once those initial moments of all that hype and that excitement started to wear off, and once I was getting used to playing this game and seeing what it had to offer, the great reality about Star Wars Battlefront began to show itself. This game is not going to have that much content at launch, and there's a reason why this is going to happen. I'm predicting it right now, so mark my words. It's going to happen because DICE had way less time to make Battlefront than they had to make Battlefield 4. The only way they could release a game that was stable and not nearly as bad or broken or buggy as the last game they made was to make sure they had a completely watered down, simplified game where they didn't have to spend all this time designing maps and balancing tons and tons of guns. So instead, we're going to get a game that has very few maps and few guns and really not that much depth to it. The game is going to play like a simplified arena-style shooter. No real need to use aim-down sights and no real need to spend hours and hours trying to hone down and get down some really advanced skill sets. And I think that it's going to do better on console in the long run than on PC. Now granted, the game's going to sell huge on all platforms because it's Star Wars. This is a huge brand. But I strongly believe that in just a few months' time, say just the first quarter of this game being launched, within the first 3 months, you're going to see a far greater player base on the console side of things than you will on PC. I believe that the single most important aspect in any game nowadays should be, number one, is the game fun? And I think that is the main takeaway about Star Wars Battlefront. This game is not going to be the next big hit esports title. This game is not intended to be this highly competitive, advanced, skilled, arena-style shooter like, say, Counter-Strike. This is a casual game, but that's not a bad thing. I think that Star Wars Battlefront being a casual game is okay. There's nothing wrong with that. And the reason why I believe a lot of people in the community, especially a lot of members of the gaming media, are rather surprised by that is because we've gotten so used to the idea that a first-person shooter always has to be a highly competitive one, instead of the idea that it's okay to have a first-person shooter, or third-person shooter for that matter, that's not a serious, highly competitive esports title, but instead a casual one designed just to have fun. On the flip side of the coin, however, the next question that's been a huge one in the community so far is, how casual is too casual? Now, as I mentioned earlier in the video, I believe that DICE kind of cut away a lot of the content that we were expecting. For example, we already knew they were not going to include space combat. We also knew there would be no single-player story or campaign. Having said the lack of those major components that were in the previous Battlefront titles, what then do we have? And what I see here is not really that much content to work with. So this is the one area where, even as a huge Star Wars fan, I'm very concerned about Battlefront. It looks like Battlefront's going to have less than half the guns and half the maps that were in the previous title. Now granted, many of you are going to say, well dude, the last Battlefront also included planets from the Clone Wars era. Sure, I see that point. But even with the lack of those worlds or the lack of battle droids as enemies or playable characters, I'm still very reluctant about the planets that we do have here. And here's what I'm talking about, okay? Think about the survival map that we played on Tatooine in this open beta. If that is just a smaller section of the regular big Tatooine map and there's no other zone on Tatooine, like for example no Mos Eisley, that will be a missed opportunity by DICE. I mention this because as of right now, it seems like the only confirmed planets that we know of are going to be Tatooine, Hoth, Endor, Solist, and Jakku. In the case of Jakku, that's going to be a timed pre-order exclusive, so if you don't pre-order Battlefront, you won't gain access to that map until a later time. So this lack of planets is a big area of concern for me, followed by what I see on the existing planets as a huge spawn problem. The player spawn points in the beta have been absolutely horrendous. I'm talking about some of the worst spawning that I've ever seen, allowing players on opposing teams to spawn camp an entire round. As I showed in this video here, riding around an ATST, I went on a very easy 20 kill streak, namely because these enemies kept quite literally spawning at my feet, like the game had no built-in mechanism to prevent players from spawning right under me while I'm riding around the ATST, which was totally OP. And part of why I think the spawning has become a huge problem, it's because in Walker Assault there is no flag system like we saw in Galactic Conquest in the previous title, and therefore you have no control over where you spawn. I'd say the same applies even to Drop Zone. These huge flaws with the player spawning in Battlefront is directly tied into the next big area of concern, which is the entirely revamped loadout system. Loadouts in Battlefront 2 and in Battlefront 1 were directly tied into what zones you controlled and how you were going to spawn into them. The zones that you held would also affect your decision making in exactly what kind of class you were going to choose. Let's say that you had a flag and an adjacent flag was being contested by the enemy team. Well, then you could choose to spawn at the flag that you currently hold as a sharpshooter, and then help out your teammates as an effective long-range sniper. In this version of Battlefront, what I see is that there's really no decision-making with classes like that. Everything is basically the same. You're going to load out with a run-and-gun class, and then you're going to rely upon whatever power-ups you can find in the battlefield. So you get these power-ups that are completely random, except that when it comes to vehicle spawns, they're actually not that random. So DICE is going to have a lot to work with in this next month. They've had over 9 million players play the beta, and that's great for them, but they have a lot of questions to answer and a lot of problems to solve. The spawning is terrible, the power-up system is questionable. Maybe they need to tweak it in some way or change how vehicles work in this game, namely how you obtain getting into vehicles in the first place. And then they also need to demonstrate that given that there's no single-player campaign, how much variety will this game offer? Or is this game going to follow the same trajectory that Titanfall fell into? As a huge Star Wars fan, it really concerns me because everything else, aesthetically, visually, the audio, it's all amazing and stellar. But I'm just concerned that when I pay the price that I pay to get this final product, it might be half of a product. And yet again, this is where rationality and common sense will be thrown out the window, because for me personally, from a collector's standpoint, I'm going to get this product anyways, and many of you out there are in the same boat. Hopefully that's not the case, and hopefully we don't get a game with such few planets and such few weapons to use. I love the Star Wars franchise and the Star Wars brand, and I hope that DICE doesn't miss a great opportunity with this game. If you enjoy the commentary here today, then like the video and share your thoughts and your comments down below with me about your overall opinions and takeaways in playing Star Wars Battlefront. Thank you guys for hanging out and watching. I'll see you next time.